I love telling people about Jesus. And I'm really kind of fortunate. You see, I get paid to study and teach the Bible. And I absolutely love my job. I'm paid to teach, but I tell others about Jesus because I'm a child of God. And the story of God's radical love for us is just too good to hold on to. Now, over the years, I've been honored to see people respond to the offer of salvation that God makes to all. And I've experienced some pretty spectacular rejections to the gospel message as well. Now, there are many reasons why people reject the offer of the gospel. Now, I'll freely admit this is anecdotal, but the number one reason that I hear for rejecting the gospel is the belief that I don't need a savior. Because after all, I'm not that bad. I mean, you put me up against Hitler or Genghis Khan or Vlad the Impaler. I'm not that bad a guy. I actually had a person leave the church once because I said that not all good people go to heaven, and this person was incredibly offended and never came back. So next on Digging Deeper, I'd like to take a journey with you through the kingdom period of the nations of Israel and Judah. And I hope that we'll see not that I hope, I know we're going to see an unbroken record of failure. My plan in this video is to just quickly look at a representative number of the kings of both kingdoms. And then I want to make a couple of observations that I think may be relevant to us today. So let's start in the northern kingdom. Now, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel set not only the standard for all who followed, but he laid out the sin that led to the downfall of all the kings who followed him. And in fact, we even get a line here that this particular king, whoever it is, insert name here, followed in the sins of Jeroboam. So Jeroboam the first, he was the first king of Judah. He was the servant that God told Rehoboam that he was going to take 10 tribes from Rehoboam and give them to somebody else. And Jeroboam was that other person. And so we find that account in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 25 to 33, where it says, "And then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and he lived there. And he went out from there, and he built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, 'Now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David, if this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they will kill me, and they will return Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will return to Rehoboam, king of Judah.' And so the king took counsel, and he made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, 'You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, the gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And he set one in Bethel, and the other one he put in Dan. And then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. And he also made temples on the high places, and he appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah. And he offered sacrifices on the altar. And so he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests to the high places that he had made. And he went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, on the month that he had devised in his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel, and he went up to the altar to make offerings." So Jeroboam, was put on the throne by God himself. And God put him on the throne because of the sin of Solomon, specifically turning away after false idols. And Solomon led the people of God into the altars of these false demonic gods. And so Jeroboam put together a system of worship to rival the temple system that Yahweh had put in place. And he replaced the temple with two high places, and he gave the people an image to worship. And in doing so, he did three things. The first was that he made worship easy. There was no reason to travel to Jerusalem to sacrifice to a God that we can't see when we have a golden calf. Now, calves are cute. And we have a cute golden calf to focus our attention on. And it became so much more convenient. And the second thing that he did was he mimicked the worship of the one true God. You see, Jeroboam wanted to make things like worshiping in Jerusalem. Because after all, God is still speaking. And so he had all of the trimmings without the rules. And the third thing that we see is the result of the first two, is that he led the people away from God. You see, the counterfeit will never bring a person closer to God. Sin will always follow, and the result will always be pain and suffering. And from that time on, we find a pattern of the kings of Israel. For we see in 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 25 and 26, it says, Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, began to reign over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah. And he reigned over Israel for 2 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the way of his father, and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. Now, this led to a change in dynasty. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 33 to 33 and 34, it says, In the third year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, began to reign over all Israel at Tisra. And he reigned for 24 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. And then if we were to jump all the way to the last king, the last real king of Israel, in 2 Kings chapter 15, beginning in verse 27, it says, In the 52nd year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, began to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 20 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the sons of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. So the northern kingdom of Israel, as a nation, actually never walked in a relationship with God, no matter the person or party that was in power, and the result was the same. In other words, there was no hope, there was no change. No matter how much it was promised, their collective sin became so abhorrent to God that God kicked them out of the land, and they entered into captivity to the Assyrians in 722 BC. But what about the southern kingdom? After all, they had the Davidic heir, the heir of promise. Things must have been much better down south, right? Well, let's take a look at some of the southern kings. Now, things were a little better in the southern kingdom of Judah. In fact, there were a few righteous kings in the southern kingdom. And they actually have a time of over 100 years where they had a righteous king after a righteous king. There were like 3 or 4 of them in a row. But the southern kingdom, they even started on the wrong foot. Not only was Rehoboam not a very bright man, but he was also not a very righteous man. And so he and his son after him led Judah astray, and they didn't serve the Lord. And we see this in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 22 and 24, where it says, And Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins that they had committed, more than all that their fathers had done. For they also built for themselves high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land, and they did according to all the abominations, the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So Rehoboam's son followed in his father's footsteps and continued to lead the people further away from God. And it isn't until you get to the third ruler of Judah that we begin to find some hope. And here we find the overview of Asa's reign in 1 Kings chapter 15, beginning in verse 9, where it says, in the 20th century, in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa began to reign over Judah. And he reigned for 41 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. And Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as David his father had done. He put away the male cult prostitutes out of the land, and he removed all the idols that his fathers had made. He also removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother because she had made an abominable image for Asherah. And Asa cut down her image and burned it at the brook of Kidron. But the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true to the Lord all his days. Now, so Asa loved the Lord, and he did many things right. But there was a small throwaway line in this otherwise glowing review. It said, but the high places were not taken down. And so here we're going to find two characteristics of the kings of Judah. And this is going to be true all the way down with a couple of notable exceptions. I would argue really one notable exception. And the first is that the wicked kings ignored God altogether. I mean, in fact, it came to a point in their history where they couldn't even find the law. I mean, the book of the law was missing. And so, but the thing is that it wasn't so much that they gave lip service, they just completely ignored him. And so it was as if Yahweh didn't even exist. And they were left up to their own devices. And of course, we know where that leads. That leads to sin. But those who love the Lord, the thing that we see with them is that they tolerated sin in the country. In fact, it says that they allowed worship to take place in the high places. Now, worship on the high places was mostly pagan worship. Now, sometimes it was Yahweh worship, but even then, the people were supposed to worship in Jerusalem. And so what they allowed here was even in the places where they say, well, we're not worshiping to Ishtar, we're not, or to Baal or somebody else, we're actually worshiping to Yahweh, but they're still doing it on their own conditions. And so what they had was they had Yahweh plus. And in fact, only one king in the history of Judah who destroyed the high places and absolutely desecrated them so they would not be able to be used again was the king Josiah. And he was the last of the righteous kings. And history tells us that he had perhaps the lowest approval ratings of any of the especially righteous kings in Judah, because he got in the way of their comfort. He got in the way of how they had always wanted to do things, and he actually stood by what God wanted them to do. Now, the fact that there were a handful of righteous kings in Judah, that allowed them to last longer than the southern kingdom and their siblings in the north. But ultimately, their sin caught up with them, and they were carried off into captivity in 586 into Babylon. Now, you may be saying, well, Dan, this is fascinating history, but how does this apply to me? And I really am kind of glad that you asked. So I want to make a few observations from the kingdom period, and we'll take a look at some of the prophets here and as we go along. But I want to make a couple of observations from this broad part of history. Now, again, we're looking at hundreds of years. We did it really fast, but there are some observations that I think are true across the board that I think are applicable to us. And the first is that human governments will commit the same errors that the kings of Israel and Judah committed. They will either offer up a counterfeit, they will ignore God altogether, or they will allow worship to God as long as sin is tolerated. And that's kind of what we've seen in our country, is that the very first thing that we would see when our country started to move away from God was they offered up a counterfeit. And we see that in our schools with secular humanism and naturalism and so on. Well, we don't need God. We don't need the supernatural. We don't need his antiquated morals. No, we'll just replace him with ourselves. And so for those who didn't want to replace God, what they're going to do is, well, then we'll just ignore him completely. And so we'll keep God out of the public sphere, out of any kind of discourse. And so we've come up with this quote unquote separation of church and state which never doesn't exist in the Constitution. It existed in a letter that Jefferson wrote to a friend, had absolutely nothing to do with the Constitution itself, but we've kind of put that in to where any kind of Judeo-Christian understanding needs to be divorced from our public sphere. But if we're going to allow God in, we're going to allow God in under our circumstances. So as long as sin is taught, you can believe whatever you want. It's your free will. You can believe whatever you want, as long as it doesn't impact your life. So as long as you tolerate the sin, as long as you go along to get along, you're going to be fine. And we'll find that throughout human history that governments are going to go along with one of those three tacks. They're either going to ignore God completely, they're going to replace him with something else, as they did with communism and so on, or they'll allow any kind of worship to Yahweh to be allowed, to God to be allowed, as long as sin is tolerated. Anything else is bigotry, homophobia, whatever you want to call it, and that we can't have. Now, second observation that I want to make is that if by chance there's a righteous government, that righteous government will be hated. I think about, I was watching I got a phone call for an opinion poll, and for the House of Representatives here in Connecticut. And after a while, I began to realize that the poll was paid for by one of the particular candidates. And so I found it fascinating that the slam that the one candidate had against the other was that this one candidate believed that murdering children was a bad idea, and we should do something to limit that. That was their major pull. This was what made him so bad, was the fact that he believed that murdering children before they're born was a bad idea. And actually, that we should not be mutilating our children, and that parents should have a say in how they raise their kids. This was the bad side about this person. And then the upside of the other candidate, the one that I was getting the phone call for, was that they were in favor of murdering children. They were also in favor of mutilating kids. And this was the more moral take from this particular opinion poll. And it was absolutely fascinating to me that here was the one candidate who was actually standing for biblical morality and righteousness, and that was actually looked down upon as something that was evil and wrong. Whereas what was absolutely evil was looked on as being good. And so if by chance you were to have a righteous government, a government that was going to stand up for what's right, and we're seeing that in Florida, they've gotten away from a lot of the rainbow jihad stuff and things like that. And that I was getting my hair cut. This gal was talking about she didn't want to go to Florida because she didn't like the politics there. And I'm thinking to myself, okay. That was kind of bizarre, because here was a government that was actually doing righteous things, and they were hated. And the third observation I want to make, and I think this is most important for us today, is that government will not save us. I think it's the most important observation, because, see, governments are made up of flawed human beings. And it's time for the people of God to stop relying on government to make things right. In other words, we need to heed the words of King David as recorded for us in Psalm 20, verses 1 through 7, where he wrote this. He said, "May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of God, the God of Jacob, protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. May he remember all your offerings and regard with favor your burnt offerings. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your plans. May we shout for joy over your salvation. And in the name of our God, set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all of your petitions. Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed, and he will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving might of his right hand. Catch this. Some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will place our trust in the name of the Lord our God. Because you see, what we see from the kingdom period of Israel with the kings is that man and the leadership of men will always come up short. And so God must do something. And I mean, that is the message of the gospel, is that whenever we are trying to find salvation, whenever we're trying to find wholeness or whatever in the affairs of a man, we'll always come up short. And the only one that matters is what are we doing with God. And so we're going to spend some time over the next couple of weeks. I want to take a look at the fact that as the kings are getting worse and worse, the average person still has a responsibility to serve Yahweh. And so we're going to find out that God raised up the prophets to show them what it meant to serve Yahweh, even when the government is completely wasted in serving the kingdom of the world. So I pray that you are encouraged by these words. I pray that just as we look at a world around us, that we'll find out that, yeah, there really is nothing new under the sun. And I pray that you have a wonderful time in worship with your siblings in Christ this week as you worship God. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless y'all.